I'm sorry, I know you're eating, I know it's really hard, I apologize. We were supposed to bring the food out a little bit later, but we're gonna go with it. And I'm really glad to see everyone enjoying the food because it's always a good positive thing. Okay, so very briefly, last weekend there was a conference in Rhode Island, Portsmouth, Rhode Island, on women and the American Revolution. It was called Behind the Lines. It was basically unsung heroes of the American Revolution. I went with Diane Schwint, right there. I met the lovely Diane Fish when I was there. Thank you very much. But I just wanted to say it was really interesting because it took place in the Quaker Meeting House. And I had really always been interested in Quakerism, but I had never attended a service. I was very glad I did. And I came into contact with Carly when Zach Studenroth, whom many of you in this room know, he's written several books, and he's the architectural historian who has worked on so many structures in our area, told me that the earliest, when I said, have you found any African American education, any schoolhouses? And he said, the earliest I have found has been the Quakers who were teaching African American children. And he said, there's a woman at the Friends Academy in Locust Valley. She's just brilliant. She's a researcher, an archivist there. Her name is Carly Hoenzsch. So I was able to finally make contact. And in the process of talking, I asked her if she would talk at this conference because I feel there has not been enough said about pacifism, Quakers, anti-war stance, and also the people who have been jailed throughout time for having an anti-war stance and for not wanting to engage. And I'm going to let Carly take the stand. I've been introducing everybody with a book. I don't know if any of you have read The Women by Christian Hanna. It's a brilliant book. It came out a few years ago. It's about Vietnam War nurses who eagerly sign up to become nurses in the war. Toward the end of the book, they become veterans, Vietnam veterans against war, and march to Washington as Vietnam veterans against the war, but finally only can find peace and serenity in nature, Mother Nature, living outdoors. They need the peace, they need the serenity. They are trying to channel the light, the serenity, and understanding of why their lives had proceeded the way they had. And even though this is not a book about Quakerism, I just feel there's a parallel with what we try to understand about taking a stand on pacifism and neutrality, and no one can explain that better than Carly, so thank you.
Let's begin with a moment of silence. Hi, and thank you for the introduction. I'm so excited to be here today to speak about Quaker women and the American Revolution. This topic is one of immense personal and professional interest. For more than a decade, I've managed an archive of Quaker history with holdings going back to the late 1600s. Throughout this time, I've had the pleasure of working with many researchers across the globe. Quakers are essential to any understanding of American history in a general sense, and Long Island's history in particular. On a personal level, while not myself a Quaker, I'm continually inspired by this tradition's long-held commitment to peace, justice, equality, and communal decision-making. The Quaker tradition has always held room for people on the margins and offers the term attender to describe those like myself who attend Quaker meetings, subscribe to many Quaker testimonies, and generally align with Quaker principles without formal membership. If you need a refresher, who are Quakers? Quakers today are as varied in practices as they are united in the essential testimonies. Some Quakers hold to a firmly evangelical Christian understanding of their faith, while many Quakers might be non-theistic. Most Quakers in North America adhere to an unprogrammed model of worship with no ministers, but other Quakers, such in Kenya and other parts of East Africa. Also, most Quakers live in the Southern Hemisphere, not the Northern Hemisphere, and the majority of Quakers live in Kenya. Might have a minister and incorporate music and singing. More than anything else, Quakers are united in their shared testimonies and historical legacy. Founded in the 1600s by George Fox of England, Quakers get their name from an interaction between Fox and a judge who imprisoned him for a year at Derby. George Fox said, quote, The time has come for men to quake and tremble before the Lord. The judge replied, so you are Quakers. And the name stuck from that point on. Quakers worldwide are referred to as the Society of Friends. This term derives from John 15:14, which reads, quote, "Ye are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you." Quakers speak of testimonies rather than beliefs or doctrines because the word testimony better encapsulates the practical outward expressions embodied through their practices. One such testimony is equality. In the early years of the faith, this testimony was lived out by refusing to remove one's hat when greeting others, a traditional sign of respect and deference connected to the English class structure. Likewise, Quakers did not bow when in the presence of would-be superiors. These practices were seen as countercultural and disruptive. The Quaker testimony of equality also found expression through the role of women who could serve as ministers and engage in social action. George Fox once said, "What canst thou say? You will say Christ saith this, and the apostles say this, but what canst thou say?" His wife, Margaret Fell, would later reflect that with these words, George Fox had, quote, "opened us a book that we had never read in, nor indeed had never heard that it was our duty to read in. The light of God in our consciences, our minds never being turned to it before." This inner book, this inner light, created a culture of literary sisterhood. As early as the 1650s, nearly half of Quaker publications were written by women. By 1700, 20% of all literature written by the women of England was written by Quaker women. Quakers elevated women to the position of spiritual mothers whose words, actions, and bodies transmitted the truth of God's inner light. To ensure that women's voices were not silenced or drowned out by men, Quakers in England adopted the practice of separate women's meetings for business, which are meetings in which Quakers engage in collective decision-making and discernment. In language and customs, Quakers practice something called plain speech. Quakers do not make vows or promises. They do not take oaths. Their word is their word. For a long time, Quakers used language that was semi-archaic, even for their own time, by adopting the familiar pronouns thee and thou to address all instead of you, which was reserved to address the upper class at the time. Quakers believe in an inner light that guides people. Interpretations of this inner light have varied over the years. Today, some Quakers dispute the idea that Quakerism is a strictly Christian religion centered on God, while recognizing historical roots of the faith, while other Quakers believe in a return to the scriptural traditions present throughout their history. This inner light guides Quaker actions. During meetings for worship, Quakers practice sitting in silence together and speak when they feel moved by this inner light. Another key Quaker testimony is the peace testimony. For nearly 400 years, Quakers have stood for peace and the nonviolent resolution of conflict. When Quakers arrived in America in the 1600s, they imported their peace testimony and radical message of equality. As in England, they were persecuted heavily for their peace testimony, and other colonists, particularly the Puritans, enacted bodily violence upon them, including public whippings, executions, and mutilations. When Charles II became King of England, American Quakers delivered this message: "The Spirit of Christ by which we are guided is not changeable, so as once to command us from a thing is evil, and again to move unto it. And we do certainly know that the Spirit of Christ will never move us to fight and war against any man with outward weapons, neither for the kingdom of Christ, nor for the kingdoms of this world." American Quakers' commitment to the peace testimony was eventually accepted or tolerated by other colonists into the 1750s. In that time, Quakers became known for the aid they provided to Native Americans and role as peacekeepers and mediators. However, even before the 1750s, Quakers did not escape persecution. New York Quakers were occasionally fined from 1693 to the 1720s for refusing to participate in the militia. The start of the 7 Years' War in 1754 was a different situation. In 1755, a Militia Act was introduced. Quakers were fined for not joining the militia. New York City and Dutchess County Quakers originally paid these fines. However, Westbury Monthly Meeting on Long Island was the first not to pay those fines. So New York Quakers, feeling a bit ashamed, feeling a bit left out, followed suit, which led to a period of seized assets and property from 1756 to 1762. These events solidified Quakers' commitment to peace and provided the groundwork for means of nonviolent resistance. These acts of nonviolent resistance also prefigured the American Revolution through boycotts, which were started by women. Some Quakers, like Hannah Griffiths of Philadelphia, were involved with this early movement. Her poem from 1768, The Female Patriots, addressed to the Daughters of Liberty in America, captures her enthusiasm for the American resistance to English imperialism while criticizing men's complacency in the face of tyranny. Since the men from a party, on fear of a frown, are kept by a sugar plum quietly down, supinely asleep and deprived of their sight, are stripped of their freedom and robbed of their right. If the sons so degenerate the blessing despise, let the daughters of liberty nobly arise. And though we've no voice but a negative here, the use of the taxables let us forbear. Then merchants import till your stores are all full, may the buyers be few and your traffic be dull. Stand firmly resolved and bid Grenville to see that rather than freedom, we'll part with our tea. New York Quakers engaged in other forms of social activism during this time, particularly through their vocal support for abolition. In 1773, members of Flushing Meeting asked members not to purchase enslaved people. In 1776, New York Yearly Meeting prohibited all Quakers from being slave owners. That same year, Westbury Quarterly Meeting listed at least 150 manumissions. The archives I manage have many of those manumissions as part of their collection, many of which are under-researched and could use a lot more support. Please get in touch with me if you're kind of interested about that. In addition to freeing enslaved people, New York Yearly Meeting looked after their welfare and provided reparations through education, employment, and direct aid. Before we explore the events of the American Revolution, we should turn now to the kinds of sources available from this time period that reveal the lives and views of Quaker women. The poem that I read a moment ago appeared in a commonplace book, which is a notebook containing copied and original works. This practice enabled groups of literary-minded women to promote shared reading interests and writings with one another. Commonplace books likewise made the process of reading and writing a social experience. One could select one's audience while also sharing information that could pass on to a broader network. Sometimes these books were printed and used in education. Quakers were a dominant force in the early American educational system through these women. These educational books as well, were around like 1810 to 1830, they would also become like the most essential dominant textbooks used both in England and America. Quaker educational publishers completely led the way with the development of American and British education in that period. Commonplace books both ensured the relative literary freedom of Quaker women while limiting them to a more private sphere. Hannah Griffiths, the creator of the poem read earlier, made 2 attempts to publish her writing. Her first poem, on the death of His Late Majesty King George II, appeared in the Pennsylvania Gazette next to an advertisement for a cure to venereal diseases. The poem was also accompanied by a note mocking her entry as a mere performance. Her second attempt to publish her work was even less successful. Again, the editors of the Gazette, none other than Benjamin Franklin and David Hall, decided not to publish her second submission and instead provided a demeaning note and public message addressed to Griffith's pen name to discourage other such submissions. In addition to the external pressures placed upon Quaker women to limit their engagement in the public sphere, internal Quaker practices limited women's freedom in political discourse. Quakerism in America underwent a reformation in the mid-1700s. The Reformation sought a return to early Quaker principles such as pacifism, truth, and a rejection of worldly norms through a withdrawal from civil society and government. Betsy Ross was one such individual impacted by the Reformation, as she was disowned by her Quaker meeting for marrying outside the faith. Quaker reforms also led to the disowning of Quakers who sided strongly with the American rebels or otherwise sought to engage directly with the affairs of the day through civil society. Despite these internal and external limitations, Quaker writers like Griffiths wrote about the revolution and directly engaged in economic disruption through boycotts. Milcom Martha Moore was perhaps one of the most well-known Quaker writers from this era. Although a devout Quaker, she was disowned by her meeting for retroactively violating a marriage rule. Despite this, Moore continued to write about political issues from a Quaker perspective. Like Griffith, she was frustrated at early American revolutionaries. When boycotts failed to bring about desired changes, men blamed women as materialistic consumers who had failed to hold the line, even though women had been the primary architects and enforcers of the boycotts. In response, Moore and Griffiths emphasized the importance of openness and honesty in female solidarity while recognizing the perils that surrounded such friendship in a time of informing, disownment, and imprisonment. Elizabeth Drinker was another Quaker woman from Philadelphia, whose father had been exiled from Philadelphia and imprisoned in Virginia. Her poem, Ode for the Year 1778, reflects the perils even of female friendship in a time of informing and disownment. Each hasty word, each look unkind, each distant hint that seems to mean a something lurking in the mind, which almost longs to lurk unseen. Each shadow of a shade offends the embittered foes who once were friends. Based on the writings of these Quaker women and others, the position of Quaker women in the early days of the Revolution can be characterized by guarded support for reforms and freedom sought by patriots through boycotts and nonviolent means, while remaining opposed to war. Quakers were likewise skeptical about the cause of freedom as championed by patriots, which did not provide room for pacifist supporters and excluded women and enslaved people. Quaker women were doubly wary after women had generally been blamed for the perceived failure of the boycotts. I will now provide a very brief overview of the actions of New York Quakers during the American Revolution before returning to the words of these women. In 1774, the First Continental Congress asked regents to form committees to stop the importation of English goods and exportation. New York Yearly Meeting, which provided spiritual guidance for all Quakers meetings in New York, discouraged and disowned Quakers who participated. Fearing war, New York Yearly Meeting asked monthly meetings to raise money for social aid. On Long Island, Quakers were located primarily in western Long Island and eastern Suffolk. Quakers in Islip and Huntington did not join the Continental Association because they believed that it would lead to war. Throughout the war, many requests were made of Quakers to join the American militia or contribute to the war effort in some way. In nearly all cases, Quakers resisted these efforts and were imprisoned and fined for their commitment to the peace testimony. In 1775, New York City asked New York Friends to provide a list of all Quaker men between the ages of 16 and 60, which was refused. In February 1776, American patriots jailed a number of people from Queens, including 3 Quakers for not voting. By late spring, a few Quakers from Flushing were drafted, and one was arrested for resisting. In this year, the British took New York City and controlled western Long Island and Westchester County. The British Army occupied various meeting houses, including the Flushing Meeting House. Some Quakers received rent for this occupation. However, the New York Yearly Meeting decided to return the money to the British government. In December of 1776, the Provincial Congress required men to pledge allegiance to the fledgling republic, which violated the Quaker practice against taking oaths. The only Quaker to comply later repented. Some Quakers were also exiled for not accepting the new American currency. In January 1777, British Governor Tryon of New York was not happy with some Quakers engaging in, quote, revolutionary activities, end quote. So he asked Quakers to pay for clothing for British troops. In response, New York Quakers disavowed those actions while also refusing to comply with his request. By spring, New York State developed a constitution that exempted Quakers from the militia if they paid a fine. In July 1778, New York Yearly Meeting banned quartering army horses or transporting military supplies. In November 1779, Westbury Quarterly Meeting investigated and learned that some of its members had not followed this rule. During the winter, American soldiers in Dutchess County were in the midst of raiding corn from the farmhouse of Edward and Anna Briggs, both Quakers. When the soldiers came downstairs, they were greeted by Anna, who welcomed them for breakfast, which led them to apologize for stealing, on account of the warm hospitality that they received. In 1779, several young Quakers were imprisoned for not joining the American militia. In response, Purchase Monthly Meeting provided certificates of membership to authorities, which led to their release. In January 1780, the British required most men to enroll in the army. Quakers and firefighters were exempt, but were asked to, quote, exert themselves in case of emergency. New York Monthly Meeting decided that, quote, friends complying therewith or aiding in or doing something in lieu of military service, end quote, would be supporting war. In July, British Governor Robertson required Long Island to provide firewood to barracks, give 2/3 of their hay to the army. Westbury Quarterly Meeting let Flushing and Westbury meetings know that they couldn't do this. By the end of the war, New York Quakers incurred significant financial losses amounting to more than 13,000 pounds because of their pacifist stance. Of this amount, more than 12,000 pounds went to the American side. At least 109 New York Quakers fought in the American Revolution. Of these, 46 supported the British, while 63 supported Americans. 71 of these Quaker men were disowned. Of these, 46 for direct military service and 15 for aiding the war effort in some way. The number of Quakers who fought in the war was assuredly higher, as several Quakers had migrated out of New York City and Long Island, some eventually joining the Continental Army. While the timeline I've just provided tidily captures the major elements of New York Quakers during the American Revolution, it fails to capture the lived realities of women during that time and their agency. One of the most powerful accounts of the Revolution, told from a Quaker woman's perspective, is the journal of Margaret Morris of Burlington, New Jersey. Born in 1737 as the daughter of a shipping merchant who struggled to pay his debts, she was left behind in Philadelphia to be raised by her elder sister. She married in 1758 and became widowed while pregnant with her 4th child. At the time of her husband's death, all of her 4 children were under the age of 7. Margaret Morris was one of the first American women to practice medicine professionally. She had many patients and treated a number of ailments, especially patients suffering from smallpox. She died in 1816 at the age of 79. She kept a journal for the sake of her sister, Milcom Arthur Moore, the Quaker writer mentioned previously. This journal was compiled during the war. In December 1776, Margaret was in Burlington with her family when the Continental Army's boat arrived on the river. Many city inhabitants fled, but Margaret decided to remain behind. On the 12th of December, 1776, Margaret wrote the following entry about her decision to stay behind. We went to bed last night without fear, trusting in the arm that has hitherto shielded us, although the gondolas lay just before our door, and the report of an intention to fire the town in the night had reached us about 9 o'clock, and our good Uncle W. sent down and begged us to come with the whole family up there. And in turning it in my own mind, I got a little unsettled. But when I had concluded to stay where Providence had placed me and trust in him alone, my mind received the answer of peace. And in that peace, I went to sleep and awoke in the same. Oh, may I be truly thankful. This entry and others reveal how the Quaker worldview provided the answer of peace to fear and violence. This peace was sought after by many women who lived through these times. In addition to Margaret Morris' journal, 3 other wartime journals by Quaker women are worth mentioning. Elizabeth Drinker and Sarah Logan Fisher of Philadelphia were loyalists at heart but neutral in how they acted during the war. Meanwhile, Sally Wister of Philadelphia was very much in support of the American cause. Of Margaret Morris, it should be said that although she was pro-British at the onset of the war, she eventually came to identify with the American rebels. In her journal, even while referring to the American Army as our officers and our ragged troops, Margaret Morris embodied the Quaker testimony on peace when reflecting on the American victory at Trenton on Christmas Day in 1776. Quote, "The loss on our side not known. Instead of goodwill, envy and hatred seemed to be the ruling passions in the breasts of thousands." Elizabeth Drinker, whose father had been exiled, visited George Washington in 1777 and asked for her father, amongst those 20 Quaker men who had been imprisoned, to be freed. Although she found Martha Washington to be a, quote, sociable, pretty kind of woman, end quote, Drinker declined her invitation for tea. Drinker observed that the leaders of the Continental Army, according to her perspective, were disorganized when she wrote that, quote, "Our great men, or ye men in power, are quarreling very much among themselves." She was not impressed by George Washington and his leadership. George Washington did not free the Quakers, but did allow Drinker to visit her father in prison. Sarah Logan Fisher described the British General Howe as amiable, cautious, tender and humane, and fit to rule, while describing Washington as someone with a heart depraved by ambition, an ambition that wishes to raise his own fortune by the ruin of those whose souls have too much virtue, not to oppose the violent and wicked measures now carrying. Perhaps most famously, Mary Lindley Murray of New York City was a Quaker woman who saved the lives of thousands of American soldiers on September 15, 1776. Israel Putnam landed in Manhattan with 3,500 American soldiers. Little did he know that 8,000 British and Hessian troops would soon land nearby at Kips Bay in New York City at the site of the Murray estate. While Murray and her daughters served tea to the British generals to create a distraction, her maid kept a close eye from the second floor to make sure that the American army was able to pass through without issue. By entertaining these generals, the American army was able to proceed north without casualties. Quakers sometimes use queries to guide individual or shared reflection. At this time, I invite all of you to settle into a moment of silence as we reflect on the legacy of these women during the American Revolution. I will end this moment of silence with a handshake, which you may also do with your neighbor. I am happy to answer questions, although I do understand I'm also standing between you and eating, so please feel free to proceed.
Thank you for that excuse me, overview. I would comment that in the Revolutionary period, Quakers were a much higher proportion of the population on Long Island than we think of them today. I mean, what were there, 8 different meeting houses or meetings? At least 8, I don't know the number, I haven't figured it out, but maybe you know.
I don't know the exact number, but yes, it was tremendous. Islip and Huntington, for example, when they declared the neutrality, that was because there were just so many Quakers living there who had that kind of influence. Although they didn't participate directly in political society, there was, of course, William Penn's famous Quaker experiment in Pennsylvania. By like the 1750s, primarily because of that 7 Years' War, Quakers decide not to vote. They decide to withdraw from civil society. They decide not to hold positions in government, but they continue to exercise influence and pursue peace and equality in ways outside of civil government.
Hi, how you doing? I was just wondering, the modern day Quakers, are they very similar in philosophy to the revolutionary Quakers? Do they vote now? Do they advocate for peace also? I don't know much about them.
Sure. You would get a lot of different answers from Quakers. Quakers have a lot of room for people with different views. Largely speaking, Quakers, due to a split that occurred partially through something that happened on Long Island in the 1830s, which was the Hicksite Orthodox movement, Elias Hicks was someone who led this kind of reform movement within Quakerism that emphasized more of the inner light aspect of it, more of this idea of continuing revelation, and also this sort of idea that people should listen directly to their conscience. They still use scripture, they still had kind of that biblical basis to some of their beliefs, but at the same time, it also developed this two different philosophies, two ways of approaching Quaker views. Some view it as a philosophy or spirituality, others view it as a Christian religion. Yet Quakers remain united about certain really key testimonies, so peace, equality, simplicity, those are really key. During the Quaker Reformation, for example, in the 1750s, John Woolman, who was a traveling minister many of you have probably heard of, he would refuse tea, he would refuse also to wear any clothes with dyes because they depended on the transatlantic slave trade. And Quakers today still engage in a lot of boycott movements like that, but they also do vote. American Friends Service Council, for example, and a number of other organizations received a Nobel Peace Prize in 1947 or 1948 for assisting with the war efforts after World War II, and they continue to be also a pretty powerful force in pursuing peace and social activism.
Can you talk a little bit about the archives at Friends Academy that you supervise?
Sure. So our archives comprise of a lot of records. We also just had a new archives space created. I am the director of our library program and also oversee that cross-divisional library program across two buildings. One of our buildings has a beautiful archives, and it has records that go back to the late 1600s. A lot of that consists of school records, of course. The school was started in 1876, and it was also started as a way to promote equality and the peace testimony. We also have holdings from Matinecock meeting, which was mentioned earlier, and Westbury meeting. This year, too, I also coordinated the 300th anniversary of Matinecock Quaker meeting, which celebrated 300 years since the original construction of their meeting house. But the history and roots of that Quaker meeting go back much further. By 1671, it was one of the first officially organized Quaker meetings, and it might have been the first, except I think Flushing beat them by about 1 week, so it's kind of unusual. Yes, the Bound House is in Flushing. I don't have so much to say about those, sorry. Yes? So there are a good number of Quakers on Long Island, not a huge amount. I would probably number them in the hundreds, perhaps 1,000. New York Yearly Meeting is the overall, they were mentioned previously too, so the way Quaker meetings get organized is you have very regional, kind of local Quaker meetings. They also have monthly meetings where those smaller regional ones might operate with those monthly meetings, and then that kind of scales up to the yearly meetings. Once a year, pretty much all Quakers in New York attend the New York Yearly Meetings Conference, and that's where they decide upon different messages and their testimonies and how they're going to live them out that year. In terms of Quaker education, though, Quaker schools remain a very positive and very popular force too in American education, where the roots of that Quaker educational tradition inform that educational approach. On Long Island, like Westbury meeting is probably the most attended. I don't know exact numbers, but I would say they probably have like 40 to 60 people on any given weekend. Matinecock meeting, that I have assisted them with many projects, they have 8 regular attendees, but they probably have somewhere from like 40 to 70 folks on the registers. There are Quakers all over. If we're expanding to also include the boroughs, then Brooklyn Friends is the most well-attended Quaker meeting in the area.
Do Quakers proselytize?
No, Quakers don't convert.
So, I'm coming.
One more question, and then,
Hi,
That was incredible. I took so many notes. My hand hurts. One of the questions that we get a lot in Setauket is that in turn, sorry, we know it's not accurate, is that Robert Townsend is portrayed as a Quaker, which to the best of our knowledge, the Townsends were not Quakers, correct? So I know they get this at Raynham Hall all the time, and so my question is just about being portrayed as a pacifist or as neutral or as nonviolent as part of the resistance. What do you think in terms of like showing them as Quakers just so that he didn't want to participate? Do you think that Quakers are misportrayed or misinterpreted in pop culture or in society? Are they just known for furniture? Like if you go to the Met, like people get Quakers and Shakers confused. They're misinterpreted as being Amish. Like what are those misconceptions that we can kind of clear up when people come to the museum and ask about that specifically?
I think, raise your hand if when you hear Quakers, the first thing you think is Quaker oats. So I grew up in upstate New York where there is a long Quaker tradition. I grew up in a little town called Stillwater, which had one of the oldest Quaker communities in North America and was also well known for their peace testimony, as well as being a significant stop along the Underground Railroad. I could go on and on too about Quakers' participation in the abolition movement, which doesn't even start in the 1600s. It actually starts even earlier in the 1670s. I will say, yes, some of the common misconceptions about Quakers is that they don't vote. Quakers today definitely vote. There are some who might abstain, who might take a more quietist approach. Again, that's just kind of the range of approaches and perspectives kind of afforded to Quakers to interpret things according to their conscience. Also that they don't really speak and they just kind of sit in silence for a long time. By the way, who thought that kind of felt like a long time? Would you like to know how long that was? 52 seconds. So Quakers might sit together. Most Quaker meetings in North America and in Europe, they're unprogrammed meetings for worship, so they might be organized around some type of query like the one I had up, or they could just be people like sit down and people might stand up and speak something on their conscience or on their mind. It could be a little thought they had. It could be a really meaningful kind of message to the community. It could just be something they heard in NPR that morning and just want to repeat, or they want to talk about their commute. They're a very informal group, and I have a lot of respect for that. Thank you.